Focus on Abilities is brought to you by Tier Memorial Herman, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence. In the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden. I'll be your host for today's program. I'm professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, and I direct a program called Independent Living Research Utilization at Tier Memorial Herman. We've got a very interesting program for you today. I'll introduce our guest in a second, but I want to ask you a question, one we will answer before the end of today's program. You've seen adapted vehicles for people with disabilities, particularly those of us who use wheelchairs and have mobility impairments. How much do you think it costs to do those adaptations? What's the typical range of those costs? We'll answer that question. You may be surprised at how high or how low the cost is, and our guest can help us do that. We'll introduce him right after we take a break here from Focus on Abilities. Please stay tuned. This is Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and our guest today is Jason Roberts from Adaptive Driving. Jason, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thank you.
Jason, I said you were from Adaptive Driving. That implies it has something to do with mobility. What is the company?
Well, basically we're a company that focuses on wheelchair accessible vehicles on many different levels. As simple as installing hand controls on a vehicle for someone to do the gas and the brake with their hands as opposed to using their feet, all the way to fully converted wheelchair accessible vehicles for someone to enter and exit the vehicle while sitting in a wheelchair, up to what we define as high-tech driving controls, electronic gas and brake, joystick driving, for someone, let's say, who's going to be driving from their chair, entering, exiting the vehicle, and always being in their chair. So anything to do with vehicles.
I'd like to get into detail about some of those in a minute, but first I'd like for our viewing audience to know a little bit more about Jason Roberts. You obviously use a wheelchair and presumably use an adapted vehicle yourself.
Yes, sir.
How long have you used a wheelchair?
Actually, it'll be 32 years next month. And I was injured in 1980, just one of those stories like so many we hear. My brother was playing with a gun, had taken the clip out, assuming, that the gun wasn't loaded or it wouldn't fire. And there was still a bullet in the chamber, and as brothers can be, we were picking on each other, and got the gun went off, and so I'm T5 paraplegic, so mid-chest down.
And your brother? He must have a depression that's still not over.
At the time, I didn't realize it, but growing up, what he had to deal with in his mind, I think was a whole lot different than what I had to deal with. And I think I would have rather had to deal with the chair, than what he had to deal with.
Yeah. So the lesson there is don't play with guns whether you think they're loaded or not.
Exactly. Exactly.
And how old were you when that happened, Jason?
I was 10 years old. It was 2 days for my 11th birthday.
So all of a sudden you're in a wheelchair, you can't walk, you're 10 years old, you go to the hospital, you go to some rehab, I suppose, and then you're back at school?
That took a little while, and as you know, even better than I, that period, the early 80s and moving on, there were so many changes going on. Initially, I was in a hospital, if I'm correct, I think 3 or 4 months, and that was in Beaumont, Texas. I was transferred here to Houston at a place that, of course, is no longer there, but it was called Plaza Del Ora. Mm-hmm. Then after Plaza Del Ora, actually, I went to Tier. But a good year went by before I started school. They did offer tutors and teachers that came to the hospital, and that would have been my fifth grade year.
And you tried to go back to school in Beaumont then?
Yes, sir.
And the school had ramps and bathrooms?
No, at that time, the bathrooms were pretty good, but no, we did not have ramps. The first 3 years, so I guess that was 5th, 6th, 7th grade, there were always older kids that I would get out of class 5 minutes early. They would carry me up and down the stairs with my wheelchair. It was in 8th grade that I was finally able to go to a school that was all one floor.
Wow.
And if I had ramps.
Those kids did it voluntarily, or did the school arrange that? Or you?
Well, they did it voluntarily, and I think they really enjoyed the fact that they could get out of class 5 minutes early and could be late 5 minutes. And we certainly took advantage of that time we had as well. Never got dropped. I will admit that was always my biggest fear. And I don't think anything ever really happened. But, yeah, it was about 3 years there. I was carried up and down every day.
So, Jason, you're pretty athletic. I've seen you shoot a few hoops. Did you get involved in wheelchair sports?
I did. I guess I was about 13. So about 3 years into it, there was a group of older guys in Beaumont, and they were called the Rolling Outlaws. And at that time, it was still your typical hospital chair, but they would modify. Cut off the armrest, and if it didn't have detachable armrest, and they would lower the back. I was the youngest kid, I think at the time. They were all either late teens, 20s, early 30s, and it was not to the extent of wheelchair basketball today. We practiced maybe 2 times before a game, and that would be over a 2-week period. It was neat because suddenly you were amongst others yourself that you could bond with, but at that time we still did a lot of barbecuing and just had fun on the court.
Yeah.
I attempted recently to go back and possibly be an asset for a wheelchair basketball team, and that proved to me that I just don't have what it takes
Over the hill.
to play today. Yes, sir. They're serious.
So you finished high school and went to college and then went to work, right?
I had some college. Actually was on my way to California. Had never seen the hill country in Texas, and as far as I made it was Kerrville, Texas. And it seemed like a good place to kind of get my head together, you know, any young man, much less being in the chair. And actually at that time I got a job at James Avery, selling James Avery jewelry at their main location in Harper, Texas.
So you just went into a jewelry store and said, "Can I have a job?"
Yes, I did.
And
I lucked out. Little did I know how much I lucked out.
Did they think twice before they hired you? I mean, a guy in a wheelchair, young guy?
Not really. At that time, there was the knowledge of hiring people with disabilities. You know, the Americans with Disabilities Act had not been signed yet. There was rumor of something going on, but that was really about it. But it still seemed to be the thing to do. And I must admit, I think being in the chair, because of my age, being so young, I really think actually being in the chair had its advantage. Maybe a willingness there to give the opportunity and see what worked out. And I learned a lot at that job.
Worked that job, and then what happened?
From there, actually, I was contracted by the state as a job coach, which meant whether someone had a physical disability or predominantly my caseload was some who had mental disability or challenges, just working with them on particular skills, being by their side on the workplace if they needed it, advocating for that individual, looking for work, and continuing to advocate for employment of people with disabilities as a whole. And that came as a result of the human resource manager at James Avery at the time, talking to someone else, and yes, sir, I just kind of fell into that and was very fortunate again.
I think I met you, Jason, when you were working for a TV station in San Antonio, didn't I?
That is correct. Actually, I had gone to a convention, and I believe it was called the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities in Dallas, and I had heard rumor that there was a television network, like many networks at the time, whether it be sport or medical, whatever the case may be, but a television network that was going to focus on individuals with disabilities. All the TV programming was going to be captioned for the hearing impaired, there'd be programs for different physical limitations and what's the latest and greatest, but also the goal was to offer some more what we would call entertainment programs that just happen to feature individuals with disabilities. Well, at the time, the Americans with Disabilities Act had been signed. There was a lot of focus, a lot of media buzz about this because it wasn't something that was requiring that you had to do something, but it really brought a lot of attention to being someone with a disability and the positive aspects of that.
So you effectively tucked your job into working at the first standalone station dealing with disability topics, right?
Yes, sir, I did. I made a videotape of myself on an 8mm home camera, just talking and telling them what a great idea I thought it was. And next thing you know, I get a phone call. I went in and interviewed, and yes, I got the job.
That's great. And how long did you work there, Jason?
It was almost 5 years.
But eventually you came to Houston, started working for ADA, right?
That's correct. I've been in Houston now for 10 years. There was a little period in between there that I started consulting with car dealers, auto dealers, on different programs, incentives, financing that was available for individuals with disabilities purchasing vehicles, any vehicle. And so I was pretty lucky that I got to go around and train a number of car dealers on the financial incentives. And at the time, I'd always driven with hand controls, you know, to do the gas and brake on my vehicle. But I have to admit, other than what I saw on buses or every now and then a fully converted wheelchair accessible van, I truly was not aware of what was out there and available. And because of consulting with the dealers, I was able to learn a lot more about the equipment and really get excited. I was not aware of all the different modifications, and ultimately had met the owner of the company here, and it was a good fit, and I came on board about 10 years ago.
So Adaptive Driving really is a specialty company.
Absolutely.
And it is an auto dealer as well.
Yes, we are. In fact, I think the technical term in the state of Texas is we are a Texas Independent Mobility Motor Vehicle Dealer, which means that we have to have an independent auto dealer's license, but at the same time, there is now a independent mobility motor vehicle dealer's license, just to make sure that you have technicians that truly are certified and knowledge on working in these vehicles, that you have a 24-hour service available, because, you know, our service and someone breaking down and that individual having a disability is generally more of a priority.
So it's a 24-hour service?
It is 24 hours, 365 days a week. Wow. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Jason. We'll get more information from you about adapted vehicles, but first we're going to take a break. Please stay tuned for more Focus on Abilities. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here with Jason Roberts from Adaptive Driving Access, ADA.
Yes, sir.
And Jason, you help a lot of people with disabilities become mobile. People who have the need for some kind of assistive driving apparatus come to you from all over the country, really.
Yes, sir.
And you help them out. Now, at the beginning of the show, I asked how many dollars are required to make these adaptations, and I suppose the answer would be it depends, right?
That is the answer, and it's generally the number one question and also the toughest question to answer. You know, simply put, if someone can transfer in and out of their chair,
so they have a wheelchair and they can help themselves in and out of the chair, into and out of a vehicle.
Yes, sir. Generally, the average cost is going to be around $1,000.
Because all they need is what?
Ultimately, then, all they're really looking at is some form of driving equipment that's going to assist them, you know, accelerating, braking, possibly steering if need be. And at that point, that individual is going out and just picking a vehicle of their choice that they find works best for them to get in and out of and transfer their wheelchair in and out of.
Now, that's assuming that they can pull their own wheelchair
That's assuming that, yes, sir.
But they come to you then with that new automobile, and you put in what I know are hand controls, right?
Yes, sir.
Enabling them to move the the foot pedals with their hand.
And that's probably, for what we do in the modifications we perform every day, believe it or not, that's really one of the easier modifications. Hand controls have been around for a while, and ultimately, for those that don't know, it's going to be a bar that would extend out from under the steering column to the right or the left, and a couple of different types of hand controls, but you're normally either pushing or pushing down for brake, and then either pulling towards you or pushing down for gas, depending on what works best for you. A pretty basic design that has proven to be reliable for a number of years.
So it doesn't take long. Somebody brings the car in.
No, sir.
Later that day, they can pick it up and drive it themselves.
Yes, sir. One day.
Pretty cool. Now, what if they can't get themselves in and out of that wheelchair in that car?
That's where there's really kind of two different groups for someone who can't get themselves in the wheelchair in and out of the vehicle. So now we're looking at a wheelchair accessible vehicle that's going to allow the person to enter, exit, ride from their wheelchair, and or drive from their chair. So the two groups in that category is someone who's going to be a passenger only but stay in their wheelchair, or someone that's going to be a driver, and let's say they can get into the vehicle while sitting in their chair, and then it's an easy transfer to the driver's seat. That can be done.
Okay.
Or they actually drive from their wheelchair.
So you got really three options there.
Yeah,
The one
that
where
is
the
three.
person stays in the wheelchair and they're a passenger.
Yes.
The one where they get into the vehicle in a wheelchair, but then they're able to transfer into the seat.
Correct.
And you've got a variety of those options.
Very true.
And then the one where they just stay in the wheelchair and drive.
Yes, sir.
How much do those cost?
For someone who's just going to be a passenger only, the average modification, new modification that's out there and available is going to be around $20,000.
Okay.
For someone who's going to be a driver, let's say from their power chair, and I specifically say power chair because 99% of the cases someone is going to be driving from their power chair as opposed to a manual chair. Because normally if you're pushing in a manual chair, odds are you can transfer, or at least with some assistance you could transfer easily. Someone driving from their power chair, just the modifications to get them in and out of the vehicle and secure the chair while they're driving, seatbelt assembly, things of that nature, is probably around $25,000.
And can go up. I mean,
Can go up.
I know
Yes,
there
sir.
are people whom you've helped that have very, very severe disabilities.
Yes, sir.
People who can't use their fingers but can drive with a joystick like I have on my wheelchair.
Yes, sir.
Can actually drive a vehicle.
And that is when what we have to offer gets pretty exciting, because that's not something that we're doing every day, although we have several of those jobs every year. And like you stated, it would be where if the person didn't have the strength to turn the steering wheel, for example, we have modifications that would either reduce the effort that it takes to turn the steering wheel, or ultimately, you're not actually using the steering wheel at all. You're using one of our electronic controls, where it's a smaller steering wheel that electronically controls the steering.
Wow.
And so, and of course, that does depend on your abilities, your limitations, so on and so forth.
Jason, most people couldn't afford to pay to buy a car and then double the cost by adding these accommodations.
That's true.
Is there help?
There is, and that's probably the second question that we always get. And like anything, when it comes to funding, it depends on someone's circumstances. And let me explain. Now, anyone can go out on their own and try and finance a new or pre-owned wheelchair accessible vehicle, just like going out and purchasing an unmodified vehicle, looking at financing rates, things of that nature. Now, it's still a lot more expensive because you're financing, and you know, the average new vehicle that is fully wheelchair accessible to get you in and out, and those modifications are about $53,000. And in most cases, if someone's been recently injured, you know, what formerly was known as Texas Rehabilitation Commission, and now the Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services, depending on a few guidelines of that individual, it may take a while, and getting the information and providing what they need, but in many cases they'll provide funding support for the wheelchair accessible modifications.
That's presuming the person is really wanting to go back to work. I mean, I think that's the main qualifier.
That is the main qualifier, but they also have a program through Independent Living Services that if having access to metro or public transportation is either impossible or too difficult based on your circumstances, then they will assist with the vehicle modification funding as well. And that's really one that a lot of people aren't aware of, is the Independent Living Services program, which is managed by DARS.
So how many of these vehicles do you all sell per year?
The easiest way to answer that is I'm going to say nationally, there are thousands. And ultimately, that's really all that we can effectively monitor is the new vehicles that are being sold, whether it be through Chrysler, Toyota, Dodge, Honda, is right now averaged about 5,000 to 6,000 new wheelchair accessible vehicles sold in the nation annually.
That's a year, and your dealership probably sells a large number of those.
Yeah, I'm not privy to all the numbers, but I have a good idea. And yes, here in the Houston metropolitan area, being such a large market, we do have the opportunity to sell quite a few every year.
And you mentioned several brands. As I recall, some of the larger automakers actually did begin to build vehicles that were easy to adapt.
That's correct. And what they started doing, you have experience with this. In the past, the individual who, say, needed a fully wheelchair accessible vehicle, again, to get their chair in and out of while they're sitting in the chair, they would go pick the vehicle and then send it to someone like us, being a local mobility dealer, if you will. From there, we would ship it off to a mobility manufacturer who would go in and make the structural changes, lowering the floor, or we'd raise the roof.
Took weeks and weeks, and they rebuilt the car.
Months and months, yes, sir. And eventually, the auto manufacturers started looking at this and saying, hey, there's several of these being sold here in the nation. So when we order the vehicle new, it's already prepared, if you will, for us to go in and provide these modifications, whether it be through wiring systems, exhaust systems, fuel systems. It's prepped for us. That way, when we go in and make the changes, they're going to work 100% better. The quality and efficiency is a lot better than it was in the past.
The companies that are most cooperative like that, or what?
Well, I will say that Toyota was the one that set the trend. Yeah. Toyota is the only manufacturer in the world that actually would build wheelchair accessible vehicles on their assembly line in Japan. So if you and I wanted a wheelchair accessible vehicle, whether it was just hand controls or something to get in and out of from your power chair, you would order that from Toyota, and they built that themselves. They had more experience than anyone else.
Have the others caught up?
The others are catching up, yes, sir.
Okay.
I would say Chrysler is now number 2. They invented the minivan. In 2004, Toyota really entered the market and had the Toyota Sienna, what's called ramp van, that's fully wheelchair accessible, and they set the standard, and they set a much higher mark for the rest of the manufacturers to fall in line.
Well, that's good for all of us.
It is, absolutely. Competition's always good.
So, Jason, if somebody's interested in mobility, how do they get in touch with you?
With us, the website, which is www.adaptivedriving.com. Our main phone number is 281-487-1969. We have now 3 locations serving South Texas, 2 in Houston, 1 in Northwest, 1 Southeast, and as of recently, we have opened up a location in Corpus Christi, which is doing very well.
Okay, Jason, the phone number once more?
281-487-1969.
And they should ask for you?
Sure, ask for Jason. If someone's closer to our other location, we'll direct them there to an individual as well.
Okay. Well, this has been a most interesting show today. I want to thank you for being our guest. I'd like to thank all of you for watching. We'll be back another time with more focus on abilities. In the meantime, please stay tuned to HTV. Watch all the great programming that's available to us in the Houston area. I'm Lex Frieden. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Focus on Abilities was brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, Redefining Rehabilitation, Removing Barriers, Re-enabling Independence, and the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.